Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. This video is going to carry on looking at the reign of Henry VII, and this video specifically will be looking at the economic developments under Henry VII's reign, looking at trade, exploration, looking at prosperity and depression. Now ultimately then, we're going to begin by looking at trade, and we're going to look at the development of the cloth trade and all these different kinds of things. But it should be noted that, as a sort of broad conversation, we can see that Henry VII, during his reign, makes substantial efforts to not only strengthen his economy, but to also stabilize the economy. You have to think about the contextual elements of this economy with reference to the fact that we are coming out of the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses was a tumultuous 50 or so years, or 40 or so years of history in which you see quite a lot of civil unrest. And so the result is that the economy isn't as stable as it perhaps should have been during this time. And so his reign, when we look at it from a historical perspective, in terms of the economy, marks an important transition from this instability, the period of instability under the Wars of the Roses, to a period of greater prosperity. This is the case despite the fact that there are still economic challenges that persist. Beginning first then, Henry understood that trade, both domestically and internationally, was crucial for the recovery of the English economy, and so his policies were designed to try and ensure the stabilization of and the expansion of trade networks. One of the most significant economic developments during this time was the promotion of an organization of English merchants that controlled the export of woolen cloth. This was the merchant adventurers. These were a very important group that contributed to one of England's most important exports, the export of cloth. The establishment of this group helped to boost the wool trade in the Low Countries, and to also boost trade with France and other European markets. And we can see that by the end of his reign, we see that the woolen cloth trade, the woolen cloth industry, becomes one of the most important in terms of in England and one of the most profitable in Europe. The English economy had essentially relied on the cloth industry, which constituted, during the reign of Henry VII, roughly 90% of the nation's export value. Initially, raw wool dominated exports, but then as we start to go to the late 15th century, so the end of the 1400s, the focus shifted towards finished cloth, reflecting advancements in both domestic manufacturing as well as new processes for manufacturing, so things like weaving and fulling and dyeing, for example. But we still see that the volume of cloth exports during the reign of Henry VII increased as much as 60%. London emerged as a central hub for this trading network, with the merchant adventurers being such an influential trading company, pivotal in the role that they played. So that's the cloth trade essentially covered. In terms of particular agreements and treaties, the aforementioned Treaty of Medina del Campo from 1489 was a treaty between England and Spain. Now, what this did was not only secure succession by way of marriage alliances between England and Spain, between Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, but it also allowed the export of English wool and other goods to Spain. It also addressed the issue of trade tariffs, essentially trying to lower them in order to promote commercial relations between the two nations. But in terms of the agreements and things that are established that are expressly to do with the economy, the Navigation Acts of 1485 to 1496 are some of the most important in terms of the promotion of maritime trade. These acts essentially strengthened the navy and encouraged English merchant ships and also encourage the production of and the creation of new English merchant ships, which would reduce England's reliance on foreign vessels. Such measures then allowed English merchants to control more of their overseas trade, particularly when we look at the Mediterranean and the Baltic regions. While Henry sought to boost trade with Spain and France, we see with the Treaty of Etaples, we see a closer economic relations between France and England, and with the Treaty of Medina del Campo, we see a greater relationship between England and Spain. He also had to manage a powerful Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League was a commercial alliance that operated in northern European cities and ultimately dominated trade in both the North Sea and in the Baltic. In order to avoid such conflicts with the Hanseatic League, Henry negotiated agreements that granted English merchants access to these key markets, although this was a delicate balance and wasn't necessarily always successful. Ultimately then, by the end of the reign of Henry VII in 1509, we can see that trade definitely did expand, and it's because of some of these different policies and agreements that have been established that contributes to this development in economic growth, particularly with the wool and the cloth trade. As I mentioned already, we see an increase with the cloth trade as high as 60% throughout his reign. The export of wool and woolen cloth rose steadily, and English merchants began to accrue a larger share of markets in Northern Europe. While Henry VII was often seen as a more conservative leader, a more conservative ruler in his approach to things like exploration compared to later monarchs such as Henry VIII and particularly Elizabeth I, he did nevertheless lay the groundwork for some of the most important overseas ventures. For example, we can point to the 1497 expedition by Jean Cabot, who was a Venetian explorer. Henry VII supported Jean Cabot's voyage to North America in 1497. Cabot sailed west from England and is credited with discovering the coast of Newfoundland, which is now considered the first recorded European contact with North America since the Viking expeditions. So we talk about Christopher Columbus discovering America. Ultimately, people like John Cabot was also very, very significant in that endeavor. We start to see that although Henry's reign did not see large-scale colonial expansions that we would later see with the reigns of people like Elizabeth I, and then passing through Elizabeth I all the way to the establishment of the British Empire in its glory, we do see that things like Cabot's voyage initiated interest in the rich natural resources that were part of the New World, which would ultimately benefit England's economy in the long run. So, while Henry VII, of course, is not credited as being the first monarch to start to see the development of imperialism, we do nevertheless see the very basic groundworks of the potential for economic exploitation of native lands. But this is not a potential that is fully realized until later on in English history. So, ultimately then, in thinking about this idea of prosperity and depression, we can see that his policies aimed at strengthening the monarchy and stabilizing the country. He was a very stabilizing figure, was Henry VII. And a country essentially experienced a period of relative prosperity after the years of turmoil of the Wars of the Roses. And it is this aim of strengthening monarchy and stabilizing the economy in the country that contributes to this stability. We see that Henry's efforts to consolidate his power by securing peace with rival factions, by ensuring that there is no uprising of Yorkist causes, and by ensuring that there are no foreign wars, or very few foreign wars, we can see that this gave England a sense of political stability. Political stability then fosters economic confidence and encourages further trade and investment. In terms of financial reform, we know that Henry sought to restore royal finances and reduce the burden of the crown's debts. He implemented very strict fiscal policies. We see that through increasing the crown's income, issuing things like the taxes such as the 10th and 15th tax, which collected profits from land and estates, and started to secure grants from Parliament as well. Henry received a collection of feudal dues, things like wardships and reliefs and marriage payments, again boosting royal income. If you want to see more about the personal finances of Henry VII, go back to looking at our lesson on the government under the reign of Henry VII. Henry also controlled the production and the sale of certain goods and operated through a number of monopolistic practices. Essentially, a monopoly is when a single corporation or a single business or a single entity has full 100% control over a particular market. Monopolies are often seen as not particularly great, because if we had a monopoly of on let's say phones, for example, you would have a situation in which only one company makes all the phones and they take up about 100% of the market share. And if that's the case, then there's no competition. And it means that they could theoretically just double the price of the phones for no reason. And we as consumers would have no choice but to carry on purchasing because there's no other alternative. So usually monopolies are not seen as particularly good things unless they are what we call natural monopolies, i.e. markets that naturally perform better as part of a monopoly rather than as privatized, and so they're often under government control, nationalization. Henry would then control the sale and production of certain goods through these monopolies, granting individuals or corporations certain monopolies which allowed them to regulate markets and to raise income for the crown. And so fundamentally then, if you wanted to speak to the kind of evidence of prosperity during the reign of Henry VII, you would point to the fact that England saw quite significant growth in terms of sectors such as cloth production, trade, and agriculture. The royal treasury grew substantially as well, and Henry's careful management ensured that he was able to rule without the heavy reliance on Parliament for funding. Only having to call Parliament 7 times is an illustration of that fact. If you were then going to then start to think about the ideas of depression, the ideas of maybe particular evidence of depression, but also evidence of unrest and evidence of not particularly everything going particularly well in the economy of Henry VII, there are a few things that you could point to. The first of which could be the agricultural depressions that take place. Ultimately, England was still a very agrarian society at the time, and what this means is that the economy, because it is so heavily reliant on agriculture, will naturally always have to deal with the fact that sometimes there are just poor harvests, and this will then lead to rising food prices, and it will lead to temporary economic depressions. So, for example, there are notable crop failures during the reign of Henry VII, for example, in 1493 and 1494, which resulted in food shortages and rising of food prices and social unrest. This is just a fact of any kind of agrarian economy. Sometimes weather doesn't do what you want it to do, and therefore agriculture is affected as the result of that fact. If anybody is from a farming background who's watching these lessons, you will know full well how volatile agriculture can be sometimes when you have very long periods of rain or very long periods of no rain and all these different kinds of things, and it means that ultimately you yield less revenue, you yield less grain, and all these different kinds of things. The Crown also needed revenue through the frequent taxation policies, and this when you combine with economic difficulties more generally, will lead to social discontent. So we know already, for example, that the 1497 Cornish Rebellion was sparked by taxes that were imposed to fund an invasion of Scotland, highlighting discontent among the rural population. And then finally, we see here that there was still in some urban centres, such as London, that there was some flourishing in terms of economic development, but in other towns we see that there were higher levels of unemployment and poverty, particularly in the aftermath of the economic disruptions caused by poor harvests. So the disruptions of 1493 and 1494, for example, again contributing to greater social unrest. And so ultimately then, to conclude, you can see that there is definitely evidence that everything isn't as what it seems in terms of a strong growing economy, because there are definitely rebellions such as the Yorkshire Rebellion and the Cornish Rebellion that were largely driven by economic grievances. And the fact that these existed and are evidence that you can use shows the tension between Henry VII's policies and the economic realities faced by many of his subjects. But it should be noted that despite these depressions, on the whole, you can see that England's economy during this time saw significant developments. We see trading flourish, especially with wool and cloth, and there is a notable push towards maritime exploration. Prosperity grew, often as the result of Henry's very cautious fiscal management, but the economy also faced some difficulties, including agricultural depression and social unrest.